but I just want to
No.
put a visual up here to help drive it home for folks. Because Charles, as you know, I used to talk a lot about this topic in my previous life before Wealthion. I'll see if I can find it here, but if I can, here's a photo taken in the Klondike, I think, back in the 1800s. And these two guys are leaning up against this boulder here. That boulder is a copper nugget. It is like a Volkswagen-sized copper nugget that these guys are leaning against. We don't see those anymore. And we don't, because that was the easy stuff that was just lying around, these massive, big, copper deposits. Now we are going after, weaker and weaker grades, more and more dilute grades of copper in the world. And I'm going to try to find a photo to juxtapose here with that nugget, with the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah, which I've been to actually, which used to be a mountain, and now it's an inverse mountain. It's this massive gaping hole in the ground, and you go there, and there's just unbelievable activity with these massive trucks that are like, I mean, they're like, I don't know, 15 feet tall, if not bigger than that. I mean, the tires themselves are like 8 or 9 feet tall, that are pulling all this ore out of the ground, and it's rock that has to then be pulverized, and the trace amounts of copper they find in there is basically what we're going after now, because that's what's left, right? So I find visually that can really be a good jeller in people's mind of like what you talk about when you're like, the easy stuff's gone. Yeah,
Absolutely. The visuals will be really helpful in that regard. The other elements are that, the growth at any cost kind of economy that we have, that we've developed kind of by legacy abundance. I call it the waste is growth landfill economy, because we don't really differentiate between wasting resources. That's growth too, as people like to say. Something burns down, it's good for GDP, right? And a million cars sitting in a traffic jam going nowhere, that's burning more fuel. That's a growth element too. So we need to differentiate between investing resources and getting more out of them. In other words, instead of just waste is growth. And then that's, of course, part of the planned obsolescence. How do you make more money? Well, you force your consumers to buy a new product every 2 years. And then that ends up in the landfill. Like, we don't really recycle much of our industrial waste. We like to think we do, but the reality is we don't.
We used to stick a shallow straw in the ground in Texas and get a gusher, right? And now we have to go out into the deep sea and go look for oil that's miles under the bottom of the ocean. And we don't do that because it's fun. We do it because that's where the stuff that's left is now, right? Remember the Deepwater Horizon? Remember reading that had like more computing power and technological complexity than the space shuttle, right? And again, we don't do that because we just like a challenge. We do that because that's where the material deposits are left. It's harder to get to, it's more expensive to extract, and all that stuff rolls up into higher cost for what we're pulling out of the ground, and in many cases just scarcity, because it's just harder to find and obtain.
So that model's really not going to work anymore in an era of scarcity. The two drivers of the last 40 years of growth by any means has been financialization and globalization, right? And this is why we've kept costs down, is financialization has lowered the cost of money, of credit, and it greatly expanded the amount of credit that was available to go out and buy stuff. Then globalization sought out places with cheap labor and very few environmental standards, and places where the currency is beggar thy neighbor, always being depreciated. We moved production to those places, and so the cost of production fell. But both of those trends are now running out of rope. They've reached marginal returns. They're not yielding the results. And hence, guess what? We have inflation for the first time since basically the 1970s. So this is another one of those things of those legacy systems are no longer working. So what do we do now? And my approach is to look at like the three big elements of any economy, whether it be national or global, there's the market, right? The marketplace of transactions and production and consumption. And then there's the government. And then there's the social structure, which includes like the moral order, the sort of agreed upon moral foundations of that society, and the social contract. Like, what do I need to do to get ahead? How do I improve myself and my household? So each of those can kind of tug at the other ones and pull it forward or be pulled forward. And so we are used to seeing technological change, rapid technological change that pulls the government and society forward almost effortlessly, but we've sort of less attuned to the way that society has to change as well. And it goes through these tumultuous periods where what was acceptable in the past becomes unacceptable, and a new sort of social demand is placed on the market and on the government. And the last time that we went through this was really the 1960s, where we saw the rise of huge social changes. What was acceptable in the past, such as racial bias or unequal rights for women, these things were no longer acceptable. And same with the environmental movement. That, I think, is what a lot of people don't really anticipate. We all understand how technology changes, right? The printing press in 1500s and railroads in the 1870s. It's harder to anticipate social change because it's harder to predict. It's not the result of technology. It's enabled by technology, but it's not something we can easily trace. It just sort of pressure builds up that system isn't working, and then we have to come up with new solutions that are acceptable to the broad population, not just to the elite.
All right. Well, this is what I find really interesting about your work, Charles, which is, we have these three elements, or what I would call, what's a good way to describe them? I don't know, sort of mechanisms for how we run life, right? The market, government, and society. And I'm going to go back to what you said earlier, which is that they all evolved as problem-solving mechanisms, right? And it's like, once they don't have a problem to solve anymore, then they get into trouble, right? They become self-serving, right? And we get that inequity and the sclerosis where folks are trying to protect their fiefdoms and all that stuff, right? But what kind of gives me hope is when you talk about these great challenges, I think the average person can say, wow, that just sounds really overwhelming. Like, what hope do we have? Do we just throw up our hands in despair here? And I think your answer, and correct me if I'm wrong, is no, we have the tools to actually engineer the type of future we want. We're just not using them well. And we need to get back to using them, for us versus against us. And in many cases, it's just giving these mechanisms the right problems to go solve, right? And if I can just opine on each one real quickly and then let you run, maybe I'll go through them in reverse order. What society's job is to do is to tell the government, these are our values. These are important. Essentially, these are the problems we want addressed, right? So you talked about the 60s, right? Hey, racial bias is bad, right? We want a more equal society. That also extends to gender. We want you to fix that too, right? And so we had the civil rights movement. We had the women's movement. We made a lot of progress in a short period of time. The government's job is to, essentially sort of set the rules of the game, and then be the referee to make sure that the game is being played out the way it wants it to and is fair, and everybody's clear on where the boundary lines are and whatnot. But other than that, maybe this is my bias, it's kind of to get out of the way, right? But it's to set the parameters. And then the market's job is to go and play the game in the parameters that the government has set. And of course, when the government gets involved in the game, that's when you get, government interference and intrusion. And that's where you get I just tweeted this out the other day, Bill Maher's rant of the $1.7 million toilet in San Francisco. Maybe we can talk about that for a second, but you just get, bloat and inefficiency and unfairness and cronyism and all that stuff, right? And same thing with the market. If the market is left to itself, you end up having, the tragedy of the commons, right? Where the market doesn't value these communal assets that are so essential, where the market can get concentrated, where you begin to have, monopolistic and trust issues and whatnot as well, right? So you need the government there to be the ref, right? And again, to tell the market what it can and can't do. But once it's done that, the market can be left unfettered within those boundaries to innovate and to do the problem solving for us in terms of developing the technologies and the solutions that are going to carry us forward. So my point here is, like, we have these three mechanisms, these three structures that are incredibly powerful tools. We just need to use them the right way. And right now, it doesn't seem like we're using them well at all in any of those three areas. So that's my opining. Now I'll let you run.
No, I think that's a very good summary of the situation. And so, the government we almost forget that it has a proper role because it's decayed to the point where we sort of forget that there is a useful role for government as a problem solving structure. Let's go back
as opposed to a problem creating structure.
Yeah, which is what it is now, right? And we all have endless examples of that. So let's go back to the 1970s, which I've done recently in a variety of blog posts, because that decade is, known for stagflation, right? Various, reasons behind it. And it was it's generally dismissed as like, oh, that was a lost decade. That was terrible. It was like high inflation, low growth, stagflation. It was a terrible decade. And it's all like, well, wait a minute, let's take a look at that. Because actually that was an example of the kind of transition that we're entering now, in my view. And I'll explain real quickly. Society decided that rivers that caught on fire and rivers that were filled with dead carcasses was not a good thing. And the air, was the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day and that kind of stuff. In other words, industry had basically used the nation's environment as a dumping ground, right?
Right. We had the crying Indian. Remember that commercial?
Exactly. And so, and this was how the market functioned, because this increased profits, right? You externalize your costs and then you privatize your profits, right? So society changed, and then the government came in. Even though it was a conservative president, President Nixon oversaw the implementation with a divided Congress. Everybody got together and they put in the EPA. Now, industry didn't like this at first, of course, because it was totally upsetting and it was going to drive their costs much higher. And it did. And in fact, the United States, both private and public sectors, had to invest, in today's money, trillions of dollars in the 70s. That's why there was stagflation, because we had to invest so much money in cleaning up the environment and rebuilding and re-engineering our industrial base to become much more efficient and less polluting. And yet look at the payoff. It's like, was fantastic, because we then made our whole industrial base much more competitive, and we cleaned up the environment, which helped public health, and we created new economic opportunities. Instead of, who wants to build a condo on a river that stinks and it catches fire? No one. Now the rivers are clean. People are developing properties. There's, I posted a photo of a kayak regatta, that it used to just be a river that was so polluted, you wouldn't want to get close to it. So there's a lot of economic benefits that came out of the 70s. It just took a decade of investment. And then we've reaped the benefits for decades since.